All right. For the sake of time, and we have a lot of people on the call here, we're going to get started. So thank you all for joining today. We're really excited about this webinar. We are going to be talking about managed retreat in coastal Massachusetts. This is a presentation that's based on a survey which we conducted, and maybe a number of you guys all participated in it. Just so you know, this will be recorded. Please, as you're joining in, put your name and affiliation in the chat box so everybody knows who is here. So just an overview of the hour. We're going to present some of the results from the survey that we conducted, and then we want to make space for some conversation about the findings of the survey, and also allow for some time for question and answer. So we'll be presenting for about a half hour and then move into about a half hour time for questions and any sort of discussion. So first, Kristen Uterich is going to be doing her presentation, and then at the end, we'll have some questions for you all to kind of fuel our discussion. Just a few ground rules for this webinar. Please make sure, we are a big group here, so please make sure you stay muted during the presentation. If you have any questions, you can raise your hand or put the question into the chat box. We'll try to respond to some of them live, but after the presentation, then we'll have that time for question and answer. And I believe that is all from me. So by the way, I don't think I ever introduced myself. My name is Kim Starbuck. I'm with the Urban Harbors Institute. And now I'm going to be passing it over to Kristen, and she's going to be doing our presentation.
Thanks, Kim. Thank you all for coming. We're really excited to have you here. As Kim mentioned, I'm Kristen Uterich. I'm the director of the Urban Harbors Institute at UMass Boston. UHI is an applied research institute at the university. We do a lot of work with municipalities, and a lot of that work is in the context of climate change. And so we thought we would explore how they're thinking about the tricky topic of managed retreat. For purposes of our study in this conversation today, managed retreat is the movement of infrastructure, people, and property out of vulnerable coastal areas through processes and programs such as voluntary buyouts, relocation of roads, and zoning overlay districts. As Kim mentioned, our hour today is going to focus on sharing the reports, the findings of our report that we conducted, having some time for you all to ask questions about the report and the findings. And then we'd really like to flip it and have a conversation with you all about managed retreat and what you're seeing and what you're working on. I don't think that this slide is really necessary, but just as context, so we're all starting from the same place. Massachusetts, obviously, here we're going to feel the impacts of climate change, including heat waves and drought and rainfalls and flooding. We're particularly interested in this study in looking at the impacts of coastal sea level rise and related flooding. As some of you are already aware, there's a number of different projections floating out there, but the state's statewide climate change assessment notes that in Massachusetts, we'll see at least 20 inches of sea level rise likely between 2020 and 2050, and that goes up to 43 or more inches by 2070. In addition to sea level rise, a lot of communities are dealing with erosion at increased rates. As these issues worsen, many structures in the floodplain will become vulnerable if they aren't already. So in our work with municipalities, we see that flooding and erosion are being dealt with in many different ways. Folks are elevating structures, they're limiting new development in floodplains, they're renourishing beaches and doing a variety of different things. But one thing that we know is a potential tool in toolboxes, but we haven't heard a lot about, is managed retreat. So we thought we'd ask those working at the municipal level if this tool was on their radar, and if so, what they thought about it. So specifically what we did was we sent an online survey to 72 coastal municipalities. We surveyed harbor masters, conservation agents, planners, mayors, town managers, and administrators. In some communities, contact information wasn't available for all positions, or positions were vacant, so we didn't actually reach the same number of people in each community. But without a lot of effort, without a lot of sending follow-ups, we quickly heard back from 70 people, and those people represented 47 municipalities. Some folks responded on behalf of regions. We heard from a number of communities from more than one person. but ultimately the respondents represented 64% of the coastal communities we reached out to. And again, we were surprised that so many people responded with very little prodding, making us think that this is a topic folks are very interested in discussing. One of our first questions was whether or not communities had even considered managed retreat. Though we did receive numbers, I'm not sure that we can make much sense of the numbers. In part, I think that we should have defined what we meant by considered. We left it vague intentionally, but in looking at the data, it's hard to understand some of the findings. For example, in 9 municipalities, we had multiple respondents, and in those 9 situations, at least one person said that they had considered managed retreat, and at least one person said that the municipality had not considered managed retreat. So that's a little interesting, and it could be explained for a variety of reasons, but one of those might be the vagueness of the term considered. And one of the things we were surprised about, though, I think, is that at least 17 municipal representatives said that they had considered managed retreat. That number was a little higher, I think, than what we were anticipating. One of the key things that we wanted to know in this study was, what are the perceived barriers to managed retreat? Looking through the literature, we compiled a list of barriers that had been identified. 59 people answered this question, and you'll see that the top 3 indicated in those numbers in orange were the lack of sites for relocation, the cost of purchasing land, and concern about public response. We were curious, even though there were conflicts in whether or not some communities had or had not considered retreat, we were curious about what the individual responses of people who had and hadn't considered retreat might tell us about what the barriers were. And we haven't run statistics on these numbers yet, but you'll see pretty large differences when it comes to things like the cost of purchasing land, perceived cultural impacts, lack of public interest, lack of sufficient data to inform decision. The difference between that dark green and the light green lines gets pretty large. You'll also see that there were similarities when it comes to the loss of tax revenue, the lack of political will, lack of sites for relocation, and costs for restoring vacated property. It's also worth noting at the bottom that equity concerns were only identified as a barrier for 11 people. In our study, we recognized that we wouldn't ask all the right questions. So we left a lot of open space for people to respond. If you're interested in the report, Appendix B is really a fun, interesting read. It's all of the responses that we received. We did remove things that might identify responses or connect responses back to the person who said them, but there's a lot of interesting comments. When we asked about barriers, people specifically highlighted things like insufficient space and funding to facilitate retreat, impacts to historic structures and community character, private property rights, having a reactive rather than proactive perspective on resilience, a need for education, outdated insufficient regulations and permitting challenges, short-term planning perspectives, competing priorities for municipal resources, and a focus on individual impacts as opposed to community impacts. Again, I'd suggest, if you're interested in this, to look at Appendix B for the whole suite of responses. On the flip side, we also wanted to know whether or not people perceived any benefits to managed retreat. This question was answered largely by those who had reported considering retreat, so we didn't really separate out whether or not there were differences between those who had and hadn't considered retreat. But you'll see that the top 3 were reduced flooding of built structures, reduced maintenance of municipal infrastructure, and enhanced natural resources. It's also worth pointing out again that equity ranked the lowest in terms of benefits. So equity was the lowest benefit as well as one of the least identified barriers. We also asked people if they were interested in any tools or resources related to retreat. Generally speaking, respondents were most interested in funding strategies and budget tools, community education and outreach and engagement tools, and regulatory tools. These were the top 3 tools, regardless of whether or not people had reported considering retreat, though the level of interest and order of interest varied. And generally speaking, interest was lower where retreat had not been considered. Similarly, the same 3 tools and resources, legal assistance, training and workshops, and communities of practice were of the least interest to people, regardless of whether or not retreat had been considered. But again, the level of disinterest varied among those three tools. And generally speaking, those who hadn't considered retreat were least interested in tools as compared to those who had. We also wanted to know whether or not, well, really who municipalities might look to for assistance in providing these tools and resources. You'll see they identified a wide variety of places, including government entities, academic entities, professional associations and networks, and nonprofit organizations. Some of you on this call may actually see your own organization here. Again, we asked folks to share a little bit more about what specifically they would be looking for with tools and resources. One of the things that came through the comments was really the range of audiences that could be reached through the tools. Specifically, we heard the need to reach the general public, property owners, and community leaders. There was also an interest in case studies and lessons learned to help build on prior efforts, and suggestions about ways to look at retreat that weren't simply analyses of how much retreat would cost. The report also highlighted a need for model bylaws and regulations and for assistance with obtaining grant funds. And again, this is just a snippet of the open-ended responses, but if you're interested, Appendix B of the report has a much more lengthy selection of quotes. Lastly, we looked at what people thought about the term managed retreat. We've heard a lot about the fact that the term itself can be a barrier. Where retreat had been considered, half of the people indicated that the term was an issue and half said it wasn't. When they were prompted to provide more information about the term, folks identified the lack of understanding about really what the term meant. And also there were comments about the association of retreat with the concepts of failure or giving up. And then in that series of open-ended responses, we also heard a lot about new barriers that hadn't been on our original list. So those barriers included the perception that retreat is just more difficult than other options, and that folks were prioritizing other options like elevating structures. And that also retreat evokes emotions, including things like doubt, fear, rage, loss, mistrust, frustration, and denial. And that emotional issue came up throughout the comments. People really expressed a lot of frustration, reflected the fact that the communities were dealing with a lot of fear and anger about the situation and the need to consider retreat. The report also includes a start for recommendations on how we might think about advancing the concept of retreat. First, funding is needed for a variety of retreat-related activities, including purchasing property, moving or removing infrastructure, relocating people, managing properties, and paying for planning and legal services. While there are funding sources, many municipalities don't have the capacity to apply for or coordinate programs. So entities that can help communities write grants and secure and manage funds could help fill that gap. Outreach and education came through as a top priority for those working on responses to climate change. We heard in numerous ways that messaging about climate change is needed to advance the concept of retreat, and that messaging has to be accurate, it has to be easy for people to understand, and it has to come from reliable, trusted sources. We heard through a couple of the comments that misinformation could be enough to cause a whole effort to fall apart. While there may be an opportunity to create statewide and regional messages, another thing we heard is that some messaging really needs to be tailored to specific communities in order to be effective and to meet them where they are. And we also heard that traditional ways of thinking about retreat, especially things like the cost of retreat, need to be better communicated, and that analyses such as the cost of retreat versus doing other things, including doing nothing, should be communicated to help inform decisions. As I mentioned a couple of times, equity didn't rank high as either a barrier or a benefit related to retreat, but as many of us on this call know, whether and how retreat happens can have significant impacts on vulnerable communities, including the elderly, those who are financially disadvantaged, and others. So one of our recommendations is really to raise awareness of how equity and retreat are related to help ensure that any retreat programs are not blind to this issue. And then lastly, few, if any, communities, as many of you know, are really ready to implement significant retreat projects right now, given all of the practical, legal, and emotional challenges previously mentioned. For example, we heard that municipalities don't have places to relocate people and infrastructure, that private property rights and expectations trump planning efforts related to retreat, and that people aren't thinking about long-term impacts to their property, and so they're not compelled to relocate. There's also a lot of emotions surrounding the idea of leaving a place, ranging from sense of loss to anger. These are all really hard to overcome in the near term, but if processes are initiated now, then perhaps some of these barriers can be addressed with time, making retreat more practical when thinking about planning in the long term, 2050, 2070 and beyond. So those are our findings and our recommendations. The report is available online. You can use it, find it using that QR code that can be scanned, or the URL is really long, but if you just go to the UHI website, you'll find the project under completed projects. So that is the presentation, and we wanted to take time to answer any questions you all might have about that, maybe 10 minutes or so. So you can either raise your hand. I'm going to stop screen sharing. You can either raise your hand or put your question in the chat, and Kim and I will field those. Questions?
Hey, Kristen.
Yes.
John
John.
Duff here.
How are you?
I'm wondering, I'm well, thanks. And it's good to see everyone on this webinar. I'm wondering if any aspect of your survey elicited information from the surveyed population as to whether or not there was actually even space for them to retreat.
Yeah, that's a great question. One of the barriers identified, one of the top barriers was a lack of sufficient space. And we took that to mean, that there was really no place for folks to go. Some communities actually outright said that their communities were small, that they intended to defend, that there was no place to go but up. So we did hear that throughout a number of the comments. John?
Yeah, of the municipalities that said they had considered it in whatever fashion that means, did anybody mention, or was there any extraction of what they had done? Has anyone looked at buyouts? What are some of the strategies that the more forward-thinking municipalities are considering? I don't want to say forward-thinking, the more ahead of the curve, I guess, municipalities are thinking about implementing at this point.
Yeah, we did ask that question, John, and I think if I remember correctly, like maybe 8 or 10 people actually responded that they had conducted a retreat project, and the examples given were a lot of parking lots moved back, a lot of roads elevated. There were very few mentions of actual houses or buildings being removed. In Provincetown, they had noted that historically some houses had been moved, but that wasn't their strategy that they were focusing on right now.
And Kristen, I see a question in the chat from Emma. What role do you think regional collaborations could have in helping move the needle on retreat in Massachusetts?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think, well, it depends on what region you're talking about. I was just at a conference in New York, and there was a lot of talk about the need for federal engagement with retreat. And then there were a lot of differences, I think, between how different areas were approaching retreat. If we were to think about a region being statewide, there's certainly an opportunity for education materials to be developed that can be distributed throughout the state. Even some of that could be done on a more regional basis. I think getting to some of the things that we really didn't hit upon in the report, but that are discussed a lot in applications of retreat, are where do people go? And I think that could be something that's dealt with on a regional basis, finding receiving areas and planning for those areas to be executed, with equity in mind, and really thinking about how to do that right, I think could be done on a regional basis. I think, Emma, there are a number of ways that regional collaboration could really move the needle on this. Vince, I see your hand up.
Thanks, Kristen. I'm Vince. I work for the town of Nantucket. We have two major problems in the short term and one long-term problem. So we have many of the same problems everybody else has. We've got sea level rise and downtown areas and heavy traffic routes flooding and large residential areas that are flooding at the moment. Our south and east shores, we also have substantial erosion problems. In one place, we've got like a 70 to 100 foot high sand bluff that's eroding at an extremely rapid rate. And sea level rise is compounding both of these and making them exponentially worse over time. The main impediment in some ways that I see, okay, fine, there's the finances, there's the area to retreat into, there's all of these things. Unfortunately, one of the things that I come across time and time again is legal challenges in terms of what will work and what won't work under the State Wetland Protection Act, what will work under Chapter 91, what we can do, what we can't do is the biggest thing. Is there anything on the horizon that might see an update to manage retreat? Some carve-outs within Wetland Protection Act or similar, so that we can undertake some of the required actions to keep these as functional neighborhoods rather than just trying to carve off edges of the neighborhoods and retreat back into ever diminishing areas of land. Our biggest problem is we've got all these nice resource areas, wonderful big beaches, and we have some projects that are allowable, and that may be insufficient. We need to start looking at other alternative methods, and this is the problem we run into with state wetland protection. Is there anything on the horizon where we might be able to see special carve-outs, special dispensation given so that we can do other things rather than just what's currently permitted?
Yeah, that's a great question, Vince, and maybe somebody else on this call would be in a better position to answer that question. So if anyone on this call has a response for Vince, I welcome you to raise your hand and share. I think, Vince, though, to your point, a need for regulatory reform came up time and time again. How do you make equitable retreat possible, given the fact that it's such an emotionally charged issue that's really dominated by private property rights, and certainly folks are not interested in retreat that will result in detriment to other wetland resource areas. I think it was Situate that had considered doing a land swap with some coastal property owners, and the land that they had hoped to swap was actually wetlands that would have been undevelopable, and so that fell apart. So there are a number of regulatory challenges really complicating this issue, and my hope is that folks on this call will have seen their name in that list of entities that can help solve this problem or answer some of these questions, and we'll step up to the plate and think about it.
Can I follow up just very briefly?
Sure.
Nantucket has also got a coast resilience plan, and one of the main recommendations that came from that is to undertake a strategic retreat and relocation plan. And I'm trying to get this project off the ground at the moment, and it's going to be one of these things of, well, we have no buildable land, we've all conservation land, but we can't take that. And I don't want to take that. I'm an ecologist, I'm not going to take that. But where can we retreat to on a shrinking island is becoming an extremely difficult debate question for me, unfortunately. But so we're starting this process, and we're also just looking at whatever we can do to retreat whatever neighborhoods, services, utilities that we can. But we're too small a place with not enough area to move into. And it kind of gets to the question Julia put in the comments: what are the approaches you're considering? Everything. Looking at everything. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, Vince. And I think some communities are thinking about, how do they go back into their zoning regulations to redefine things like lot sizes and whether or not multifamily properties are allowed in what was previously single family to accommodate some of the displaced folks if retreat were to move forward. So I think this is what's frustrating, and this came through with the community comments, is that there's a lot of uncertainty about how to proceed and how to get it right. And the idea that if you proceed and you get it wrong, you may never have a second chance.
Yeah, and just to follow up on that, maybe you were, Vince, already answering this question, but Julia Neisel from CZM did ask, what other approaches are you considering? I'm not sure if that was what you were answering, but I don't know if you have anything else to add.
So yes, essentially, I tried to answer that by saying we're considering every possible approach. Unfortunately, the situation we find ourselves here in Nantucket is there's a lot of property owners that want a lot of assistance from the town in particular. And they are coming from literally all parts of the states, and they see approaches in Florida or in Georgia or California, and they say, this is what happens there. And I want this literally on a plaque. This is Massachusetts, not Florida. It's the constant problem I have. Fine, it works in Florida, but not necessarily approach we can consider here. And this gets back to the legal questions I asked at the start of my part. So we've got property owners that want to do things in conjunction with the town, and we don't think half of them are legal at the moment, even though they might be good ideas and worked in other places. But we still try and see, well, is there an element of this that could work? So back to my kind of very broad comment, we're still considering everything.
Thanks,
Great,
Ben.
thank you.
I see Tara Lewis's question in the chat about, I'm wondering if equity is not considered much of a concern because most coastal private properties are owned by wealthy people, not those that are part of the EJ community. And Tara, we had a similar thought that might be able to explain the comments or the responses that we received. But if you look at coastal communities in Massachusetts, more than half of them have at least one documented environmental justice community. So we thought if we were surveying municipal staff, that would be more on their radars. So we don't know why those numbers were so low, but certainly there's an opportunity to do more outreach and education about how retreat is or could impact environmental justice communities and other vulnerable communities, even if they're not the ones directly on the shore. So that's something definitely on our radar. Kim, are there any other questions that need to be?
Yes, there's a question from Eileen Gunn. Did you uncover any information about the decision-making process in municipalities, meaning who decides if and when they retreat? Developing consensus on risk tolerance is also really important.
Yeah, I would say we didn't uncover any information about the decision-making process, except for that I think we can anticipate that it's pretty fragmented. One of the reasons we say that is because in those 9 communities where people answering the same question from the same community had different answers about whether retreat had been considered, that might be that it had been considered, by the Conservation Commission or the Planning Board or someone, but that hadn't been communicated. It wasn't part of a larger townwide conversation. We also heard a lot of frustration in the comments about municipal leadership and the fact that municipal leaders, especially elected officials, weren't interested in putting their necks on the line for promoting retreat. And so I think the decision-making process is very complicated in municipalities, especially when it comes to sensitive issues like retreat. Another thing that came up was the fact that retreat is one of many challenging topics that municipalities are dealing with. So trying to elevate it to a priority is really challenging. So I'm not sure if that answered your question, but basically, I think we were interested in focusing on municipalities, recognizing all of the different things going on and all of the different factors at play with municipal decision-making about resilience. And that's certainly something that I think could come into play in follow-up studies or projects.
Yeah, this is Eileen. Yes, I see that as like a huge problem for municipalities, like understanding a clear decision-making process and understanding when this should happen. Maybe that's something Mass Municipal could assist with, Mass Municipal Association, giving guidance on that.
Yeah, or if somebody has done it really well and wants to put together a case study that we can share, we'd be happy to work with you on that. I'm not sure if there are other questions in the chat that really are a priority. Emma, I see your hand is up.
Yes, so we have a couple hands and then a couple other questions in the chat.
Okay, so maybe we'll spend 5 more minutes on the questions, and then we'd love to have a bit of a discussion. So Emma, I'm calling you.
Hi, so I have a two-part question. The first one is, I know that the phrase managed retreat sucks. It's not, we're not going to get anywhere calling it that. It needs a rebrand. Did anybody in the survey or kind of in your conversations have a better option that we should be calling it?
No, that's one of our discussion questions. So we were going to flip that and see if folks on this call had any thoughts. You know, I think the federal government is really focused on this idea of community-driven relocation, the idea really being that it's driven by the community, but where the community might not be driving the relocation, that might not be the best term. So no, there weren't any great suggestions in the survey. We would, let's put a placeholder in that, and then we'll hope that some of you guys can answer that question for Emma and us.
Great. I like the responses in the chat. And then part 2 of my question, which is unrelated, is given that Massachusetts has this incredible MVP program, what role do you see MVP as playing in helping prepare for, or in helping change the conversation here?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I know MVP is rolling out MVP 2.0. And if there are folks on this call who can speak more intelligently about this, I invite you to raise your hand and chime in. But I know that part of MVP 2.0 is developing municipal capacity around resilience and really trying to get folks at the municipal level to be able to do some of their own planning rather than relying heavily on consultants. And so with MVP 2.0, if part of that includes a discussion of options, then I think there's the real chance to elevate retreat and conversations about retreat-like concepts, so that that's on folks' radar. But I invite anyone who's involved in the MVP program to chime in if you have other thoughts.
Hi, everyone. My name is Courtney Rocha. I am the Southeast Regional Coordinator for the MVP program. And I think MVP 2.0 will really be about building community and relationships. And that is the whole premise, and how that plays into, I don't even want to call it managed retreat after listening to this, but it's really not, I always say this, and I think I got this from one of Nantucket seminars, where it's not a concrete and steel issue, it's a hearts and mind issue. So we're going to have to build relationships and change people, the way they're thinking about climate change and moving their infrastructure and our relationship with the coast. And that's built through community. So we hope that MVP and coastal towns who are going through MVP 2.0 can have capacity and funding to have those conversations. And then the state is going to be rolling out Resilient Coast soon, which will hopefully tackle some of these issues.
Thanks, Courtney. I knew you'd have a better answer. And then I saw somebody else had a hand up after Emma. We lost it.
I have a question from the chat from Henry Hahn. Aside from existing grants and incoming NOAA grants as part of the IRA, what can federal officials do to assist with managed retreat in both a funding and public outreach perspective?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I did see some folks from EPA had registered for this conference or for this webinar. So if any of them would like to jump in on this, that would be great. I'm not sure I have the best answer. I know at the conference in New York a couple of weeks ago, there was a lot of talk about buyouts and that being one of the strategies that's being prioritized at the federal level. But I know that there's probably much more going on. Is anyone here from EPA or Army Corps or the White House that wants to talk about that? there are resources from that conference that I can see about sharing. I know that the federal government was present and did a presentation on some of their priorities. I just didn't attend that session.
Okay, I see a couple other questions. Did any of the responses have concerns about how critical infrastructure would be impacted by retreat?
There were comments about like the need to move roads. And I think those were the types of projects that had been done where I think there's a little bit more public support because you're moving things that benefit multiple people. There were comments to the contrary, though, about the idea that it might be harder to move private property that wasn't maybe critical infrastructure, just given the fact that there's a lot more focus on private property rights. So I'm not sure that anyone mentioned specifically critical infrastructure, but I know that there was that sort of that dynamic between public and private projects.
All right, and then one more question I see is, do any towns in Massachusetts have a managed retreat plan?
Not that I'm aware of, but if you have one and you're on this call, I know Vince said he's working on one. I know Hull is working on a managed retreat project. I see Christian's on this, but I'm not sure if that counts as a full-on plan. Christian, do you want to share anything about what you're doing in Hull?
Yeah, maybe not so much that. I think, we're talking about some nomenclature, and I attended that conference too, as Kristen and I met up at the Managed Retreat Conference in New York. We're calling it a planned retreat. There might be a better word for retreat, but the idea is we're dealing with and again, it's what's the municipality, the state, or the Fed's responsibility here in all of this is a good question that we're sort of emerging from our work. And we're trying to apply this, what we call an adaptation roadmap on a neighborhood scale. So the question also is, planned retreat, at what scale is it effective against the existential threat of sea level rise? So it's almost, an arena you walk into that, oh, suddenly you're overwhelmed. But entering into this exercise and actually doing, some sort of roadmap to deal with the current issues and to capture what we anticipate as projections of climate impact into that roadmap, we include on the sort of the back end of that, on some time horizon, a retreat option, where which residential homes in this overall roadmap might have to consider that, and then and how do people feel? So I know that Vince had talked about and there's been some discussion about messaging, which I think is almost the first thing you really should focus in on and get some wisdom behind you on how to do that. And then, how do you begin to talk about retreat and whatever the terms are? So messaging is important, but also engaging at that level, finding what I think is critical neighborhood champions, and a number of different aspects to engaging the community. And I won't take too much of your time, and actually submitted an abstract to Mass FM conference this fall to speak specifically on community engagement, messaging, and this concept of planned retreat and the like. So stay tuned. And then also, if you want to get more detail about what we're doing, you can hop over to our department's website on the town website, and there's actually a specific area on the Hampton Circle of flooding project.
Thank you, Christian. Yeah, it's great work
Absolutely.
you're doing in Hull. I guess we'll take one more question and then we'd like to flip it and ask you guys some questions. I see a hand up from the Martha's Vineyard Commission.
Yeah, hi. My name is Liz Durkee. I'm the climate change coordinator at the Martha's Vineyard Commission. I don't have a question so much as we do have a retreat project going on, if this is the time to talk about it.
Yeah.
Okay, we have a pilot project for a salt marsh migration on one of our coastal ponds. We had the marsh migration zone mapped for 30 years, where the marsh will migrate within, say, 30 years. And then we identified all the structures and the septic systems in that migration zone. And we did a, comparison of the tax loss if those properties were removed with the benefits that the salt marsh provide the community. And we've done all that because we wanted to have as much, all the data and information we could possibly have before we go public or do anything more about it, because it's going to be very controversial. But what we plan to do next is to talk with the people whose properties are in that migration zone, to alert them to the fact that they're in this zone, and to talk with them, talk through this small group of people, the various options, and just really get a feel for what they're thinking. And we're hoping that that will help us make some decisions. And it's something we'd like to do with all the coastal ponds if we could.
Yeah, that's a great project. Thank you for bringing it up. I think hearing stories like what you're working on and what Christian's working on, if there's a way to capture those somewhere to share with communities as they're starting to think about this and how they even start, right? I think you've pointed out the importance of doing your homework in advance and making sure that you come to the meetings equipped. Christian, you talked a lot about the importance of messaging and educating at the outset. I'd love to think through a little bit how we capture those tools and resources for folks that are interested in doing something with managed retreat, but really just don't know where to start. So thank you for sharing that. We do have a number of questions for you all, and it is a pretty big group. I anticipate that not everyone will be able to answer these questions, but Kim, do you want to kick off the questions for them?
Sure. And just to note, there are some people have been putting in the chat some examples of, potentially some retreat type plans or long-term resiliency plans. So definitely take a look at those. The first question is, did anything from the study surprise you, or did it all fit with what you might have anticipated, potentially drawing from your own experiences? So anything surprising, anything that really stood out as notable to you, and feel free to raise your hand or you can write in the chat.
Go ahead, Christian.
Yeah, I apologize. I didn't have a chance to read the whole report up front, so I'm basing a lot on Kristen's presentation. And I remember just listening to that and going through that, just doing a lot of head shaking. So I think a lot of, I wasn't surprised. It was just more affirmation and confirmation of, sometimes as practitioners, we may feel like we're out there kind of coming up and trying to figure this out on our own. So I got a little bit more of a sense of, I know that the community is there, and it was just another a nod in that there is like-minded practitioners that are experiencing a lot of things very similar. And I know what Vince was saying earlier too was, and I'm sure all of us were sort of, yeah, I understand that, I get that. Yeah, we've seen that. So.
Yeah, and Christian, that's part of the reason why we'd had this webinar was as we were going through the data, we saw that there were a lot of similar type comments. And it's always helpful when you take a survey to know that you're not alone, right? Especially when you're working on these tricky issues. So part of the reason why we had this webinar was to really let you all have a forum to talk and to hear about what others are going through, because it sounds like a lot of you are going through similar things. Anybody surprised by anything? I know one of the things that surprised us was just the number of people that are talking about retreat, because I don't think we hear about it very often in public circles.
We have a comment in the chat from Alex. You mentioned the risk that misinformation poses to derail the entire managed retreat process, which is not necessarily surprising, but was definitely eyebrow raising.
Yeah, a couple of the comments really indicated that if they got it wrong, it was going to be an even larger uphill battle to start something new. I think we've seen not only in retreat, but in other types of resilience strategies too. All right. Then another question we had was for those of you that work in municipalities or work with municipalities, was there anything that the survey didn't ask about that, you know, one of the things we're considering is doing some follow-up work to suss out some additional information. And so we wanted to crowdsource any questions that we might have missed the first time around. And I saw something in the chat about how communities are dealing with things like brownfields. So that's certainly something that we could put on our radar. But are there other things that you guys wish we had talked about today that we haven't? Vince?
This is hopefully not too oddly specific to Nantucket, and hopefully other communities might have some similar experience. We have a large non-voting taxpayer base, people who are not resident who come here. We try and educate them during the summer. They understand for that summer, they have a benefit, we raise some money, we try and do something or come up with a plan. 9 months goes by, when they're off in a different place, they come back and they've forgotten, and the education has failed effectively. How do we deal with people in effectively touristy areas or places where there's a lot of second homes? And this is something that I've come across in only a handful of other municipalities, Provincetown being one of them, that I've chatted to 1 or 2 people there over time. And I think probably Martha's Vineyard and parts of the Cape are probably the same boat. I can't imagine, I don't know the state well enough. I've only been here about 8 years, but I just know that this is a problem. We can go through all the education, we can go through all of the decision-making we like, and then property changes hands, or people move away or forget. I wonder if that's something that could be part of a future study of looking at tourist areas in particular and non-resident areas in particular.
Yeah, that's a great point, Vince. Thank you for bringing that up. And it's certainly on our radar. No number of people are talking about who else do you engage in the communication apart from the traditional players. So could you get real estate agents or property managers to help communicate some of this information? They might be a tricky ally, but it's certainly something to pursue or consider. John, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I would think in terms of serving the education needs that probably most municipalities, I mean, they know there was a comment in there about this being the high tax base. This is where a lot of their revenue is coming in on these properties on the waterfront. So actually doing an accounting, starting to get that cost benefit analysis. We have what this benefit that's being provided, but we're not considering, all right, if these things do get wiped out, it's a question of following the money. Somebody is going to be, certain people will be made whole, other people will not be, but what is that going to cost? And then what is, as what somebody said in the responses, what's the cost of action? What's the cost of no action? I think trying to get that across to people at a very beginning stage. This feels the intractable problem that we sort of have is the same thing we deal with when we're talking about displacement, gentrification, and the housing crisis, is that housing is not just a place where you put people, it's a place where you put your money. And the whole Boston Fed study looking at the net wealth of a Black family in Boston is $8 is directly related to the fact of home ownership. And so if we as a country have decided, and as a culture have decided that the wealth of a family is dependent upon your home, forget about the fact that grandpa built that house and it's where my mother was raised and it's where I live and I don't want to see it go anywhere. Just dealing this now with my own family of an older generation dying off and properties being divvied up and passed on, you realize this is the follow the money moment. And we're asking people to give it up. So we need to really come to grips with that, or we're not. It doesn't matter how many studies we do and stuff. We have to get around this logistical thing of the money, because it's going to be huge if we do nothing, but it's going to be very large even if we do something.
Right. Well said. Well said. Yeah, definitely something that I think a lot of people are trying to understand better nationally. So hopefully one of the things that UHI and anyone else who's interested in working on this can do is start pulling together some of those resources and examples of how people are doing those cost analyses. I think it's really important, and came up in some of the comments regarding messaging, is you got to be telling a different story, right? Not just that retreat will cost you so many millions of dollars, but this is what will be the cost of not retreating. Eileen, I see your hand up.
Yeah, I think one thing that would be very beneficial to know, both for the state agencies and others, is people's general understanding of the permitting requirements in flood zones and along the coast. I often hear in public meetings, people saying, why don't you just build a wall? You know, New Bedford has a wall. Why can't we build that around our community? And just understanding like what cannot be built along the coast or in a flood zone, or how high you have to build current day for FEMA design flood elevations versus what that looks like in the future. Because I do think a lot of people are depending on building and elevating their way out of this. And most of that stuff is not permittable. And I
Yeah.
don't think that understanding is out there.
Yeah, no, those are great points. And those elevating and defending definitely came up as preferred alternatives to retreat in some of the comments. And even, you know, as you mentioned, some of those are hard, if not impossible, to do as well. So I think a lot of this also stems around the idea of the fact that planning horizons are typically looking at 10, 15, 20 years from now and not looking further into the future. So thinking through how you can make regulatory changes now that can gradually allow for things like retreat is important to put on the radar. All right, we had another question, Kim, right?
Yes. Another question is the survey definitely let us know very clearly, or the survey responses let us know very clearly that there was a need for tools and resources around managed retreat. And we know that there already are a number of efforts underway that are potentially filling some of these needs, but wanted to know if people on the call knew of other resources that would be useful for people that are or communities that are considering managed retreat. Or perhaps this confirms the need for more tools and resources for managed retreat. Well, feel free if you do have tools and resources, you can put them in the chat and hopefully people can see those there. Rebecca Haney just put in CZM has an online viewer with information about all the resilience projects they are funding, including retreat and planning. That's very helpful. And Tara? I think you might be muted.
Pull my
there you go.
microphone down.
Now we hear you.
I worked on a managed retreat story map here at the Cape Cod Commission, and I'll put it in the chat. I'm not sure how useful it'll be for a couple reasons. One, because when I was starting to work on it, there was a lot of concern about calling it managed retreat for the reasons that have already all been spoken. And it's a much more of a, I guess, maybe an educational piece. And so maybe to that end, it is valuable. And so I'll put it in the chat and people can check it out and see, you know, maybe it'll help in some capacity.
Great, thank you. All right. We had one more question. Kristen, do we want to do one more question and then wrap up? Or the question is basically something that we had already talked about, and some people put ideas into the chat, but other terms that people are aware of other than managed retreat that might be, you know, a little more crowd pleasing.
And for those looking at the chat, I think locational adaptation, shoreline realignment, John's runaway, proactive relocation.
One of the ones I really liked from the conference in New York was people talking about kind of planning for refuge and building refuge. And I think that the idea of refuge versus retreat is a really powerful one. I like the idea of something that's more holistic than just talking about buyouts, because I think that managed retreat is about a lot more than just buyouts, and it gets really pigeonholed. So thinking about phrasing that emphasizes that it's a tool among many and that it can take many different forms. Because I think people get really stuck in their rabbit holes of like, managed retreat is giving up and selling my house to the government, which nobody really wants to do.
Definitely. The terminology needs to get people to start thinking about this a little differently. One of the terms that we've heard in other contexts is letting the land heal, even if that means letting it go underwater or erode, but basically letting it do what it wants to do. Any others? Well, this has been really useful. I know we're almost at the end of the hour. We are still finishing processing some of this information and trying to figure out next steps. Certainly, I'd welcome any of you on this call if you have questions to reach out to either Kim or I, or we have Allison Novelli and Shannon Hogan also from UHI on this call. Any one of us would be happy to hop on a call with you guys. Certainly, we are not experts in this. I think many of you on this call are more on the ground and have lived experiences that provide you more experience than what we learned in our survey, but we'd be happy to talk with you guys about things that we heard, resources that we're aware of. There are a number of different entities that were identified by survey respondents in terms of people who could be helpful in producing some of those tools and resources. So we hope to think through what some of that might look like. Clearly, there's a need for messaging, and I know folks here are working on messaging for resilience for other projects. So as we can share information, we will, probably via email, but also maybe by our website. So I guess just stay in touch. Hopefully we'll have some more information to share as our work develops around this. We will send out a follow-up email with some notes from this conversation, as well as a link to the recording. So if you want to watch it again or want to share it with your colleagues, please feel free to do so. And if you have any great ideas about next steps, please reach out. We work with municipalities and partners all the time, and would love to think through some ways to keep these conversations going. I know community of practice didn't rank very high as something that folks wanted who work on this issue, but if that's something that a number of you guys would want to talk about, retreat on a quarterly basis or whatever, certainly reach out and we can try and put together some sort of conversation. Some benefit of being in a public university, we can have groups talk about awkward topics without any political repercussions. So thank you guys all for joining us for the hour. We look forward to future conversations. Take care.